Welcome to this tutorial for VoxCommando. In this tutorial, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of modifying commands and creating your own commands. So after you watch this, you should have a pretty good idea of how to create your own simple commands and how to use the editor. For beginners, we're going to start with showing you just how to change the phrasing of a command so that you can go in and edit an existing command and change it so that you can say what you want to trigger the command. So I have pretty much a blank slate here, and I have three commands that just tell VoxCommando to pay attention or not pay attention or turn off completely. So basically, the pay attention command turns it green. The ignore me command turns it yellow, and the VoxCommando off turns it red, which means that it's not processing sound at all. When you're in standby mode, yellow, it's listening to what you're saying, so it's possible to tell it to pay attention. Now, I'll demonstrate this command. Ignore me. Pay attention. So you'll see here that it understood, this is the history of everything that's happened here. It understood the pay attention command, but it's ignoring me because we're in standby. So what we need to do with this command is edit the command by either clicking this icon or by double-clicking the command. And we need to set this command to always on. Pay attention. Ignore me. So now you'll see that this is in bold to indicate that the command is always on, which means that even when you're in standby, it will perform this command. It's also possible if you go into options, you can set up a prefix mode, and in that case, then any command that you issue, if you say the prefix in front of it, then the command will be executed even if you're in standby mode. Now, let's say we want to customize the way in which we trigger this command. A command is made up of, or defined in two basic ways. In the tree, we organize our commands into groups, and we define how the command is triggered and what information will be passed to the command. So in this case, we have just a simple phrase, which is pay attention. If we wanted to extend the phrase, we could, for example, add here the word please. So now we would have to say pay attention please in order to trigger the command. We could further go into making this more flexible by creating aliases within the phrase. So we separate different possible things that we could say by commas. So now we can trigger this command by saying any one of these three phrases followed by please. Now we may not want to actually have to say please, so in that case we could make this phrase optional. So by selecting the phrase and then clicking toggle optional, you'll see that it's now in italics. That means that we don't have to say this. So I'll just save and close and do a quick demonstration. And by the way, the bin file in general, I'll discuss the bin file later, but I'm saying no here because I'm not editing the bin file. Let's do this. Ignore me. Pay attention, please. Okay, so now in the case that you've done some edits but you can't remember what you actually used, or if you're using a new configuration that has a bunch of commands that you're not familiar with, you can find out what they are by going to Help and then clicking on Generate Help menu. This will create a web document that contains an up-to-date list. It's generated based on your last save. So in this case, you can see that it's expecting you to say one of these three things, followed by the optional word please. And these are my other two commands. If you have multiple groups, then they'll be broken down like this as test group, and then you'll have the next group with various commands. So that's pretty straightforward. Now let's say we want to do something a little bit more complex. We want to do more than just trigger a command. We want to provide it with some kind of information. So let's say you wanted to set your system volume to any number from 0 to 100. So I'll create a group here, and I'll just call this volume test. Then I'll create a command by clicking on this command icon. Now remember, a command is made up of the items that are used to trigger the command, and then the actual actions within the command. So we would, in this case, we would go into edit the command, which is the same as clicking on this edit button or double clicking. And here we have basically a macro builder, and we create actions that will run in sequence here. But first I'm going to define the input to the command. In other words, the words that we say, and that is done in the tree. So I'll just, and we're not using the bin, so I'll just close this window to give us more room here. So the first thing I want to do is name my command. I'll just name it whatever I want. That makes sense. And then we need to give it a phrase. And when you create the first phrase in the command, it'll just use the command name, but it doesn't have to match. So we're actually going to start our command with set volume. And now we would allow the user to specify what the volume will be. And so instead of using a phrase, which doesn't actually have any value, we want to create what we call a payload. And a payload is the same idea as a phrase, but you can say different things and it will remember what you said so that you can use that value in your command. So in this case, I'm going to use a payload range of 0 to 100 because that's the range for my system volume. Okay, so now if I save all and close, I'll be able to say set volume 33 and it'll recognize what I'm saying, but it won't actually do anything. So I'll just demonstrate that quickly. Set volume 25. So it understood what I did, but it threw an error because there's no actual command defined yet. So we just need to go in and edit the command. That's expected, and that's how it should work, by the way. Now we need to double click the command because it currently has 0 actions, and we need to give it some actions. So rather than setting the system volume here, which I don't really need to do that for this demonstration, I will just use the on-screen display to show that we're capturing the command and the payload correctly. So I'm going to use OSD show text. And in case I went too fast there, what I did was I clicked add action, which created an action. If I wanted to perform 2 actions in a row, I would simply create another one here that does something else. If I want to delete an action, I can do that here. And there are other more complex things that we can do later on, such as looping, if then else logic, requiring user confirmation before executing a command, overriding the required confidence of a command so that, if you wanted to set this to 90, it will only execute the command if VoxCommando has returned a confidence of at least 90. But I'll leave that at 0 for now. Now here in our action builder, for each action, you have a certain amount of feedback that's given to you about how this command works. So as soon as you select, let's say I have nothing here, you'll see as I cycle through different commands, these boxes are changing. And white indicates a required parameter. This tan color requires an optional parameter, and gray means that no parameter is expected. So I select OSD show text. If I roll over here, it gives me a description of the command. And if I roll over here, it tells me the name of the parameter. So this is basically where we put our text. Now here I can click Save and Execute just to test what we've done with the command so far. So you can see it's showing us this setting volume 2. Now, how do we access the actual value that's being passed in? This is the first parameter that we've defined in this command. So we access it using this notation, curly brackets 1. And if we want to do a test parameter, you'll notice down here where it says test payloads, we can put in a value here. And when we click test, it will be as though we had said set volume 25 or set volume 30. This payload 1 will be replaced by the value that we send in. So I'm going to click test, save and execute. And you'll see that it's using the 30. So now we can save everything and do an actual voice command to make sure that it's working. Set volume 46. Set volume 90. Set volume 15. Set volume 50. Now in this case, I'm using a headset and my recognition rates are pretty good, so it can tell the difference between 15 and 50. But in some cases, because those sound very similar, if you've ever talked to someone on a phone and they've said either 15 or 50, there's a good chance that you weren't sure which one they said. And the recognition engine may have problems with that. So how would we get around that? Well, in this case, I probably don't really need to be able to set my system volume to an exact amount. It's probably sufficient for me to be able to set it to 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, or 100. But with a range, I can't do that. So I'm going to remove the payload range, and instead we're going to use a payload list. And a payload list works in exactly the same way as a phrase, which is that you can put multiple options here of things that you might say, separated by commas. The difference from a phrase is that it'll actually remember and store it in the payload. In this case, payload 1. If I then had another list below that, that would be payload 2. And just since this is purely educational, I'm going to do something that doesn't make any sense at all. And I will put in another list afterwards with just for the heck of it, to demonstrate how to use both payloads in a command. So I've defined my input the way that this command will be triggered is by saying set volume 30 green, or by saying set volume 60 black. And I should mention here that anytime you want to use payloads, you have to use a phrase first, because this actually is how the computer identifies which command you are triggering. So you can use as many phrases as you want, but you really need to have one phrase. And it's best if it's at the beginning, because as soon as you say this phrase, the computer then knows to listen for these other values that you might be saying. So I'm going to double click the command to edit our one action. And I'm going to add a line of text to show the color that we selected, just for the heck of it, using OSD add text. And here I'm going to use payload 2. And I can do a test here, 44. And in this case, I can really enter anything I want, so it doesn't have to be one of the items that was in our list. But later when we're speaking, we will have to say one of these 4 things for the command to be recognized. Here I'll do a test. And now we'll do an actual voice test. Set volume 10 red. Set volume 50 blue. Okay, so that's working great. Now, what if you don't want to use numbers at all? What if you want to be able to use more natural language? Maybe you're setting the volume on your amp and you just want a range of values, maybe from 0 to 50. How would we do that? If I wanted to say set volume quiet, it's easy enough for us to use a payload list like this. The problem with this is that our command right now is just showing the value, but if we want our command to actually do something, chances are that our action is going to require us to give it a number, not a word. So what we need to do is map a word to a value. And how do we do this? We use what is called a payload XML file. So I will delete this payload list, and I will add a payload from XML. There are 2 kinds. Payload XML that uses phrase only is basically just a very long list that's stored in an external file. And for example, when you scan your music library, it will store all of your artists or all of your albums in one of these payload XML files. And when you ask for the artist, most likely the command that we execute is going to use the actual artist's name. So we would only need to use a phrase only in that case. But if, for example, we had a command that was expecting the database ID of the artist, in that case, we would use the value phrase XML, so that when you say Bob Marley, it'll return the ID 33, which is what the program is expecting to be able to play artist number 33. In this case, we're going to map the word quiet to the value 10 and the word medium to the value 20, and so on. So I'm going to click here to create an entry. Now we haven't actually created any file yet. I'm going to double click on this, and then I'm going to click on New/Edit. So I'm now editing a payload XML file, and let's say we want our volume for our stereo receiver to use values like this. On my receiver, for example, I hardly ever turn the volume up above 20, even though I technically could put it up to 100. And here I can also use the aliases I can say any one of these three things to get back a value of 5. And here I'll just put quiet, soft, medium, moderate, loud, strong. Whatever you want. So now I'm going to save as, and we need to actually store our XML file somewhere. I like to keep mine in the payloads folder, and I'm going to just name it something that makes sense to me. Now I've saved the file. If I want to change anything, I can click Open Edit. And if I click Save here, it will actually store this path in the tree. And you can see, if we look in the Payloads folder, that we have this file. And it's stored, if we actually edit the XML, just simply storing the phrases and the values. Everything is done in terms of defining how the command is spoken and how the payload is sent to the command. Now we just need to go into this and remove our second payload because we're no longer using, or the second action, because we don't use payload 2 anymore. I'm going to save this and demonstrate. And I'm going to load up my help here just so I can see what our options are. So here you can see we have our second group, and we trigger the command by saying set volume, and then these curly brackets show that we're using a payload, and we see the first thing that we can say, the second thing that we can say, the third thing that we can say, and then it stops after 3 because there could potentially be hundreds or even thousands of items in a payload XML file. It just gives us the first few. Okay, I'm going to test it. Set volume very quiet. Set volume super quiet. Set volume soft. Set volume medium. Set volume loud. Set volume brain crushing.